I need you to understand something before I tell you this story. In 15 years as a forensic pathologist at the Wayne County Medical Examiner's Office in Detroit, I've cut open bodies that have been pulled from the Detroit River after 3 weeks in summer heat. I've performed autopsies on victims of industrial accidents where I had to piece together what used to be human beings from fragments scattered across factory floors. I've examined the remains of house fire victims, their bodies contorted into the pugilistic position, flesh charred to the bone. I thought I had seen everything that death could offer. I was wrong. The body of Kieran Blackthorne arrived at our facility on a Tuesday morning in October, delivered by the Detroit Police Department's crime scene unit. According to the accompanying paperwork, Mr. Blackthorne, aged 34, had been found deceased in his apartment on Cass Avenue 3 days prior. No signs of forced entry, no obvious trauma, no suicide note. The neighbors had called in a welfare check when they noticed an unusual smell emanating from his unit. Though when officers arrived, they described the odor as sterile rather than the typical decomposition scent we're all familiar with. That should have been my first warning. I remember wheeling the gurney into Autopsy Suite 3 with my assistant, Rosalie Chen, a meticulous technician who had worked alongside me for 7 years. Rosalie had an almost supernatural ability to anticipate what I needed during examinations, often handing me instruments before I asked for them. She rarely spoke during procedures, preferring to let the evidence speak for itself. But as we positioned Mr. Blackthorne's body on the stainless steel table, she broke her usual silence. "Dr. Caldwell," she said, her voice carrying an unusual tremor. "Something feels wrong about this one." I looked at her with surprise. Rosalie wasn't prone to dramatics or superstitious nonsense. She was a woman of science, just as I was. "What do you mean?" I asked, pulling on my latex gloves with practiced efficiency. "The temperature," she replied, wrapping her arms around herself despite the fact that our autopsy suite maintained a constant 68 degrees. "It feels like it dropped 20 degrees the moment we brought him in." I paused, considering her words. Now that she mentioned it, I could see my breath forming small clouds in the air. The digital thermometer on the wall still read 68 degrees, but the cold seemed to emanate directly from the body itself, as if Mr. Blackthorne were a block of ice wrapped in human skin. "Possible hypothermia," I noted aloud. Making my first observation, "We'll check core temperature during the examination." But as I approached the body to begin my external assessment, I noticed something that made my clinical detachment waver for just a moment. Despite having been deceased for 3 days, according to the police report, Kieran Blackthorne looked as if he had died moments ago. His skin retained a pale but healthy pallor, with no signs of livor mortis, the pooling of blood that creates purplish discoloration in dependent areas of a corpse. There was no rigor mortis in his limbs, which should have been present and then dissipated after 72 hours. Most unsettling of all, there were no signs of decomposition whatsoever. "Rosalie, check the refrigeration logs," I instructed. "When was this body actually brought in?" She consulted her tablet, scrolling through digital records. "According to this, he was brought in yesterday morning and has been in cold storage since arrival. But Dr. Caldwell, ... double quotes." She paused, her dark eyes meeting mine with concern. "The intake photos show the same level of preservation. Even at the scene, there were no signs of decomposition." I nodded, filing away this anomaly while beginning my systematic external examination. I started with the head and neck, noting that Mr. Blackthorne had been a reasonably attractive man in life, dark hair cut short, strong jawline, no visible scars or tattoos on his upper body. His eyes were closed, as they should be, but as I leaned in to examine his facial features more closely, something made me step back abruptly. His eyelids had opened. "Did you see that?" I asked Rosalie, my voice sharper than intended. She looked up from her notes. "See what, Dr. I stared at the body. The eyes were closed again, just as they had been when we first positioned him on the table. "Nothing," I said, though my heart rate had noticeably increased. Probably just gas release causing muscle contractions. But even as I said it, I knew that explanation didn't fit. Gas release typically occurred much later in the decomposition process, and this body showed no other signs of putrid. I reached over and gently opened one eyelid to examine the cornea. The eye beneath was a startling shade of green, so vibrant it seemed almost luminescent under the harsh fluorescent lights of the autopsy suite. As I held the eyelid open, I could have sworn the pupil contracted slightly, as if responding to the light. Impossible, of course. Pupillary response ceases immediately upon death as the muscle Muscles that control dilation and constriction require active neural input. I attributed the apparent movement to my own nerves and released the eyelid. I snapped open the moment I let go. Jesus Christ, I muttered, stumbling backward and nearly colliding with the instrument tray. Doctor, Rosalie's voice was tight with concern. What's wrong? I forced myself to approach the table again. Both of Mr. Blackthorn's eyes were now wide open, staring directly at the ceiling with that impossible shade of green. But as I watched, paralyzed by a mixture of scientific curiosity and primal fear, his gaze seemed to shift. Not dramatically, not in any way that could be captured on film or presented as evidence, but with the subtle tracking movement of someone following an object across their field of vision. He was watching me. We need to document this, I said, my professional training overriding my personal discomfort. Get the camera and photograph the facial positioning. Include close-ups of the eyes. Rosalie moved to comply, but as she raised the camera to take the first shot, the digital display flickered and went black. She pressed the power button repeatedly, but the device remained unresponsive. Battery must be dead, she said, though I could hear the doubt in her voice. I'll get the backup camera. While she left the room, I continued my examination, determined to maintain scientific objectivity despite the increasingly unsettling circumstances. I used a handheld digital thermometer to check various points on the body. The readings were consistent and deeply disturbing. 62 degrees Fahrenheit throughout, nearly 20 degrees below normal postmortem temperature, even accounting for refrigeration. If you're finding this case as disturbing as I did, please subscribe and comment below. I need to know I'm not alone in experiencing something this inexplicable. When Rosalie returned with the backup camera, she found me staring at the body's hands. Mr. Blackthorn's fingernails, which had appeared normal during my initial assessment, now seemed to be embedded with what looked like skin tissue and dried blood. Not underneath the nails, as one might expect from defensive wounds, but actually embedded within the keratin structure of the nails themselves, as if the tissue had grown there. Rosalie, I said quietly, look at his fingernails and tell me what you see. She approached cautiously and examined the hands. They looked normal to me. Dr. Caldwell, maybe a little pale, but nothing unusual. I blinked hard and looked again. The fingernails appeared completely normal, clean, well-trimmed, with no embedded tissue of any kind. But I could have sworn, with absolute certainty, that moments before they had contained organic material that had no business being there. Never mind, I said, though my hands were now trembling slightly as I made notes on my tablet. Let's proceed with fingerprinting before we move to internal examination. As Rosalie prepared the ink pad and fingerprint cards, I tried to rationalize what I was experiencing. Perhaps the stress of recent cases was affecting my perception. Perhaps the unusual preservation of the body was triggering some kind of psychological response, making me see things that weren't there. In pathology, we're trained to observe without prejudice, to let the evidence speak for itself rather than imposing our own interpretations on what we discover. But when Rosalie pressed Mr. Blackthorn's right thumb onto the ink pad and then onto the fingerprint card, we both stared in silence at the result. The print was there, clear and well-defined, but as we watched, the rich patterns seemed to shift and change, rearranging themselves into entirely different configurations. That's impossible, Rosalie whispered. I took the card from her hands, studying it under the magnifying glass. Fingerprints are immutable. They're formed in the womb and remain unchanged throughout life and after death. They are the most reliable form of human identification we have. Yet the print on this card was definitely changing. The loops and whorls transforming into different patterns even as I observed them. Take another print, I instructed, my voice hoarse with disbelief. We repeated the process, and the same thing happened. The second print was completely different from the first, and it too began to shift and change within minutes of being applied to the card. By the time we had attempted 5 different prints from the same finger, we had 5 completely different fingerprint patterns, all of which had subsequently altered themselves into something else entirely. The rational part of my mind, the part trained in medical school and honed through years of experience, insisted there had to be a logical explanation. Contamination of the ink, some kind of chemical reaction, a problem with the fingerprint cards themselves. But as I stood in that frigid autopsy suite, watching the impossible unfold before my eyes, I felt the first crack in the foundation of everything I thought I knew about death, decomposition, and the limits of human biology. And Kieran Blackthorn's green eyes never stopped watching me. I decided to step away from the fingerprinting anomaly and focus on completing my external examination. In forensic pathology, when faced with the inexplicable, the best approach is to document everything methodically and let the evidence accumulate. Whatever was happening here would reveal itself through systematic observation. Rosalie, let's photograph the entire body before we proceed, I said, attempting to regain my professional composure. Full documentation of all surfaces. She nodded, though I noticed her hands were shaking slightly as she operated the backup camera. The device functioned normally now, though every few shots the flash would flicker strangely, casting odd shadows that seemed to move independently of our positions in the room. As I continued my examination, I discovered that Mr. Blackthorn's body defied several fundamental principles of postmortem physiology. His skin, when pressed, showed no blanching or discoloration. Normally, even in well-preserved corpses, pressure leaves temporary white marks as blood vessels compress. But Kieran's skin responded like that of a living person, with immediate color return and what appeared to be normal capillary refill. Check the security cameras, I instructed Rosalie. I want continuous documentation of this examination. She consulted the monitoring station in the corner of the autopsy suite. Dr. Caldwell, that's strange. The cameras keep losing focus whenever they're pointed directly at the table. The video feed shows everything else clearly, but the area around the body appears ... blurred. I walked over to examine the monitors myself. She was right. The high-definition security cameras that normally captured every detail of our procedures showed crisp images of the room, the equipment, even our faces as we worked. But the center of the frame, where Kieran Blackthorn's body lay, appeared as an indistinct, shifting mass, as if viewed through water or heavy fog. Technical malfunction, I muttered, though my conviction was wavering. We'll have to rely on the handheld documentation. Returning to the body, I began examining the hands more closely. What I discovered made my breath catch in my throat, under magnification. I could see that beneath each fingernail was indeed organic tissue, not dirt or debris, but what appeared to be human skin with its characteristic cellular structure. But it wasn't just any skin tissue. The DNA analysis would later confirm what I suspected in that moment. The tissue embedded under Kieran Blackthorn's fingernails was his own skin, as if he had clawed at himself with superhuman force, actually embedding fragments of his own flesh beneath his nails. The pattern suggested he had been scratching at his chest and arms. Though there were no visible wounds or scratches on his body's surface, this is consistent with extreme agitation or panic, I noted aloud, though my voice sounded hollow even to myself, possibly drug-induced psychosis or severe psychological distress. But even as I spoke, I knew this explanation was inadequate. The amount of tissue present would require extensive self-inflicted wounds, yet his skin showed no signs of trauma whatsoever. It was as if his body had healed completely while somehow retaining the evidence of the damage beneath his fingernails. As I documented these findings, I became aware of a sound I hadn't noticed before, faint, rhythmic tapping. At first, I attributed it to the building's heating system or perhaps construction work elsewhere in the facility. But as I paused to listen more carefully, I realized the sound was coming from inside the autopsy suite. More specifically, it was coming from the examination table. Do you hear that? I asked Rosalie. She stopped organizing instruments and tilted her head. Hear what, Doctor? The tapping continued, soft but persistent. It sounded like fingernails drumming against metal, though Kieran's hands remained motionless on the table. I placed my stethoscope against his chest, expecting silence. Instead, I heard something that made my blood freeze. A heartbeat, not the strong, steady rhythm of a living heart, but something far more disturbing and irregular. Erratic beating that seemed to echo from deep within his chest cavity. The sound was too slow for a living person, too fast for any mechanical device I could identify. Rosalie, listen to this, I said, offering her the stethoscope. She placed the earpieces and positioned the chest piece over Kieran's heart. Her face went pale, and she stepped back abruptly. That's impossible. The heart can't beat without electrical impulses from the brain. And brain death means I know what brain death means. I interrupted, my scientific training warring with the evidence before me. But document it anyway. Note the time, the rhythm, everything. This case challenged everything I thought I knew about death. If you're following along with this medical mystery, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. As Rosalie made notes, I decided to proceed with one final external test. Using a small pen light, I checked Kieran's pupils for any response. What I saw made me stumble backward, knocking over a tray of instruments that clattered across the floor. His pupils weren't just responding to light, they were tracking the movement of the pen light across his visual field. following it with the deliberate precision of someone very much alive. And as I stared into those impossible green eyes, I could have sworn I saw them narrow slightly, as if in recognition. As if Kieran Blackthorne was not just aware, but actively observing everything we were doing to him. Against every instinct screaming in my head, I knew I had to proceed with the internal examination. Whatever was happening here, the answers lay inside Kieran Blackthorne's impossibly preserved body. I selected my scalpel, the familiar weight of the instrument providing a small measure of comfort in this increasingly surreal situation. Beginning Y incision, I announced, my voice steadier than I felt. Chimi, 2:47 p.m. The moment the blade touched his skin, I knew something was profoundly wrong. Instead of the expected resistance of dead tissue, the scalpel glided through his flesh as if cutting through warm butter. But there was no blood. Not a single drop as I continued the incision from shoulder to shoulder and then down to the pubic bone. What I discovered defied every principle of human anatomy I had ever learned. His organs were not just preserved, they were positioned in impossible configurations. The heart sat slightly higher than it should, rotated at an angle that would have been incompatible with life. The lungs, which should have collapsed post-mortem, remained fully inflated despite containing no detectable air. Jesus, Rosalie whispered, peering into the exposed chest cavity. How is this possible? But the most disturbing discovery came when I examined his stomach. Using surgical scissors, I carefully opened the gastric wall, expecting to find partially digested food or stomach acid. Instead, I found a mass of organic material that made no biological sense. Strands of dark hair intertwined with what appeared to be human teeth and small fragments of bone, all held together by some kind of fibrous tissue. Take samples, I instructed, though my hands were trembling now. We need DNA analysis on all of this. As Rosalie prepared collection containers, I used forceps to carefully extract the foreign material. The hair was long and dark, distinctly different from Kieran's own short brown hair. The teeth were adult molars, pristine white and seemingly fresh. The bone fragments appeared to be from thick, delicate pieces that might have belonged to a child. But as I lifted the largest clump of material from his stomach, something fell out that made my heart stop completely. It was a piece of paper, folded tightly and somehow perfectly preserved, despite being inside a corpse's digestive system. With shaking hands, I unfolded it. The note was written in handwriting I recognized immediately, because I had been staring at it for the past hour in my own examination notes. It was my handwriting, in my pen, on hospital letterhead. It read, Dr. Caldwell, stop the examination now. You don't understand what you're dealing with. Some secrets should stay buried. MC, the initials were mine. The handwriting was unmistakably mine, but I had never written those words. I stared at the impossible note. My name written in my own handwriting, pulled from inside a dead man's stomach. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Someone had forged my writing, planted evidence, somehow orchestrated this elaborate hoax. But the paper was warm to the touch, as if it had just been written, and I could smell the faint odor of my preferred ink pen. Rosalie, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I need to speak with Dr. Keller immediately. I stumbled from the autopsy suite, leaving her alone with the body, something I had never done in 15 years of practice. In the hallway, the normal sounds of the medical examiner's office felt surreal and distant. I could hear my colleague Dr. Sarah Martinez dictating findings in the next suite. The familiar rhythm of professional medical terminology that now seemed like a foreign language. Dr. Harrison Keller, our chief medical examiner, was in his office reviewing case files when I burst through his door without knocking. He looked up, startled by my appearance. Marlena, you look like hell. What's wrong? I held up the note with trembling hands. This was inside the Blackthorne body. In his stomach. It's written in my handwriting, but I never wrote it. Harrison examined the paper, his weathered face creasing with concern. This does look like your writing. Could you have written something like this and forgotten? You've been working long hours lately. Maybe. No, I interrupted. I would remember writing a warning to myself about stopping an autopsy. This is impossible, Harrison. Everything about this case is impossible. I detailed the strange findings, the preserved body, the shifting fingerprints, the beating heart, the impossible organ configuration. As I spoke, I watched Harrison's expression shift from concern to skepticism to something approaching alarm. I think you need to step away from this case, he said finally. Take the rest of the day off. I'll have Martinez finish the examination. But when we returned to Autopsy Suite 3, we found Rosalie standing in the hallway, her face pale and her hands shaking. I can't go back in there, she said. I tried to continue documenting while you were gone, but ... She stopped, struggling to find words. The body moved. Dr. Caldwell, not muscle contractions or gas release. It turned its head and looked directly at me. Harrison pushed past her into the suite, and I followed. Kieran Blackthorne's body lay exactly as I had left it. Chest cavity open, eyes staring at the ceiling. But something was different. The position of his head had changed slightly, subtly, but definitively. Where before he had been looking straight up, now his face was angled toward the door, toward where we were standing. The security cameras, Harrison said, moving to the monitoring station. But the screens showed only static where our autopsy suite should be. Every other camera in the building functioned perfectly, but Suite 3 displayed nothing but electronic snow. If you're as disturbed by this case as I was, please subscribe and comment below. I need to know someone else understands what I experienced. Over the next hour, I watched my professional world crumble. The temperature in the suite continued to drop, despite maintenance insisting the HVAC system was functioning normally. I began hearing whispers, not words exactly, but a constant murmuring that seemed to emanate from inside Kieran's open chest cavity. When Rosalie formally requested a transfer to a different department that afternoon, citing incompatible working conditions, I knew I was truly alone. And as evening approached, I found myself standing in that frigid room with a corpse that defied every law of biology, holding a note written in my own hand that I swore I had never written, listening to sounds that came from inside a dead man's body. The last rational part of my mind whispered that I was having a breakdown, that none of this could be real. But when I looked into Kieran Blackthorne's green eyes, I saw something looking back at me, something that knew exactly who I was and what I was thinking. Something that was very much alive. By 11 p.m., the Wayne County Medical Examiner's office was nearly empty. The night security guard, Marcus Thompson, made his rounds every 2 hours. But otherwise, I was alone with Kieran Blackthorne in the basement morgue. I had dismissed the cleaning crew early, claiming I needed to finish my examination without interruption. The truth was, I couldn't bear to have anyone else witness what was happening. In Suite 3, I had spent the evening attempting to complete my autopsy report. But every time I tried to document my findings, the words seemed to change on the screen. Scientific observations transformed into rambling, incoherent sentences. Measurements became impossible numbers. My professional language deteriorated into fragmented thoughts that made no sense when I read them back. Desperate for answers, I decided to investigate Kieran Blackthorne himself. If I couldn't understand what was happening to his body, perhaps I could understand who he was in life. I accessed the integrated database system that connected medical examiner offices, police departments, and federal agencies across the country. The search for Kieran Blackthorne returned 0 results. No birth certificate, no social security number, no driver's license, passport, or any form of identification. No medical records, employment history, or educational background. According to every database I could access, Kieran Blackthorne had never existed. I tried variations of the name, checked for aliases, searched by the physical description and approximate age. Nothing. It was as if someone had invented a complete identity for a person who had never been born. Fighting a growing sense of panic, I called the Detroit Police Department's Records Division. Officer Janet Reeves, the night shift supervisor, was someone I had worked with on dozens of cases over the years. Janet, I need information about the Cass Avenue apartment where you found the Blackthorne body, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a long pause before she responded. Marlena, I don't know what you're talking about. We haven't delivered any bodies from Cass Avenue this week. Are you feeling all right? The body brought in Tuesday morning. Kieran Blackthorne, 34 years old, found deceased in his apartment. You have the paperwork, the scene photos. Marlena, I need you to listen to me carefully. We have no record of any death investigation on Cass Avenue. No body delivery to your facility. No paperwork with that name. I'm looking at our logs right now, and the last body we delivered to Wayne County was Frida vehicular accident victim named Rodriguez. The phone slipped from my hand, clattering onto the floor. I ran to my computer and pulled up the intake records for the past week. According to the digital logs, the Rodriguez case was indeed our most recent delivery. There was no record of Kieran Blackthorne, no intake photos, no police paperwork. But the body was still there, lying on the table in Suite 3, as real as anything I had ever touched. I sprinted down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the empty building. Bursting into the autopsy suite, I expected to find an empty table, to discover that whatever psychological break I was experiencing had finally revealed itself completely. Instead, Kieran Blackthorne was sitting upright on the examination table, his chest cavity still gaping open, looking directly at me with those impossible green eyes. "Hello, Dr. Caldwell," he said, his voice a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Thank you for taking such thorough care of me. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think." Every rational explanation my mind had constructed over the past day crumbled into dust. This was either a supernatural horror beyond my comprehension, or I was experiencing a complete psychotic break from reality. "Who are you?" I managed to whisper. "I'm exactly who you made me," he replied, swinging his legs over the side of the table. Every detail, every impossible finding, every piece of evidence that defied explanation. "You created me, Dr. Caldwell, in your mind, in your notes, in your desperate need to find a case that would challenge everything you thought you knew." As he spoke, I began to remember fragments, working late nights alone, feeling frustrated with routine cases, wishing for something that would test my abilities. I remembered writing hypothetical scenarios, imagining impossible autopsies, creating fictional cases to challenge myself intellectually. "The note in your stomach," I said, understanding beginning to dawn. "I wrote that weeks ago, didn't I? As part of some theoretical exercise. You've been performing autopsies on bodies that exist only in your mind." Kieran continued, standing now, the open chest cavity revealing organs that shifted and moved like living things. "You've been writing reports on cases that never happened, documenting findings from examinations of people who never lived." I backed toward the door, but it had somehow sealed itself. The room seemed to be shrinking around us, the walls pressing closer with each passing second. "The question is, Dr. Caldwell," Kieran said, taking a step toward me, "how long have you been living in this fantasy? How many cases have been real, and how many exist only in your fractured mind?" I looked at my hands and saw they were covered in blood that hadn't been there moments before. My reflection in the stainless steel surfaces showed a woman I barely recognized, hollow-eyed, disheveled, with the unmistakable look of someone who had lost their grip on reality completely. 3 weeks, I whispered, the truth hitting me like a physical blow. I haven't left this building in 3 weeks. 6 months later, I sit in Dr. Vivian Cross's office every Tuesday at 2 p.m., recounting this story for what must be the 100th time. The psychiatrist's office is everything the morgue wasn't. Warm, softly lit, filled with living plants and the gentle sound of a water fountain. Dr. Cross has been patient with me, never dismissing my experiences, never telling me definitively what was real and what wasn't. "Tell me about the transition, Marlena," she says, her voice gentle but probing. "When did you realize you needed help?" I close my eyes and remember that night when Harrison Keller found me 3 weeks later, passed out on the floor of Autopsy Suite 3. I had been living on vending machine, food and water from the morgue's emergency supply, sleeping on a cot in the break room, performing examination after examination on bodies that may or may not have existed. The intake logs showed a dozen cases during those weeks, all documented in my handwriting, all with findings that defied medical possibility. According to the official report, I had experienced a severe psychotic episode brought on by work-related stress and chronic sleep deprivation. The psychiatric evaluation revealed that I had been hallucinating entire cases, writing detailed autopsy reports on imaginary victims, and completely losing track of time and reality. But there were inconsistencies that still haunted me. Security footage showed me working alone in the morgue for hours at a time, but the cameras never captured what I was examining. My autopsy reports were filled with impossible findings, yet the tissue samples I had supposedly collected were real human specimens that required DNA analysis to identify their sources. The hardest part, I tell Dr. Cross, is not knowing where the breakdown ended and reality began. Some of those cases were real. I know they were, but which ones? She nods, making notes in her leather-bound journal. "And Kieran Blackthorne, do you still see him?" I hesitate before answering. The truth is, I see him everywhere. In reflections, in windows, standing at the foot of my bed at night, sitting in the backseat of my car when I check the rearview mirror. Always with those green eyes, always watching, always real enough to make me question whether I'm truly recovered or simply managing my delusions better. Sometimes, I admit, but I know he's not real. He can't be real. Dr. Cross sets down her pen and looks at me directly. "Marlena, I need to tell you something. You're not the first forensic pathologist I've treated with this specific type of episode. In the past 2 years, I've worked with 3 other pathologists from different cities who reported remarkably similar experiences. Chicago, Phoenix, and Miami. All experienced, respected professionals who suddenly began documenting impossible autopsy findings before suffering complete. Breaks from reality, my blood runs cold. What are you saying? Dr. Jennifer Walsh in Chicago reported examining a body that appeared to be missing all internal organs, but somehow remained intact. Dr. Michael Torres in Phoenix documented a victim whose blood continued to flow during examination. Despite being deceased for days, Dr. Rachel Kim in Miami found surgical instruments embedded inside a corpse's chest cavity, instruments that belonged to her own set. I stare at her, processing this information. Are you suggesting this is some kind of, what? Contagion? A shared delusion? I'm suggesting that perhaps what you experienced wasn't entirely psychological. Dr. Cross says carefully, there may be external factors we don't understand yet. Environmental toxins, some kind of targeted psychological manipulation, or ... double quotes. She pauses, seeming to weigh her words. Something else entirely. As she speaks, I notice something that makes my heart stop. The notes she's been taking in her leather journal aren't in her neat, professional handwriting. They're in my handwriting. The same script I found in Kieran Blackthorne's stomach. The same writing that had filled impossible autopsy reports. Dr. Cross, I whisper, pointing at her journal. Look at your notes. She glances down at the page and her face goes pale. In my handwriting, she has written, subject remains unaware of the true nature of her condition. Recommend continued observation. The others are showing similar symptoms. Phase 2 should begin soon. MC, the pen falls from her hand, clattering onto the floor. I didn't write that, she says, her voice trembling. I never wrote those words. But I'm no longer listening. I'm staring at the window behind her desk, where Kieran Blackthorne's reflection is clearly visible, standing directly behind her chair. His mouth is moving, forming words I can't hear, and his green eyes are fixed on me with an expression of infinite patience. He raises one hand and taps his finger against the glass. Same rhythmic tapping I had heard in the morgue all those months ago. I understand now that whatever happened to me in that autopsy suite was never contained to one building, one city, or one person. It's spreading, moving from pathologist to pathologist, therapist to therapist, creating a network of impossible experiences that defy every rational explanation. And as I watch Kieran's reflection in the window, I realize that my story isn't ending, it's just beginning. Whatever I encountered in that morgue, whatever created those impossible autopsies and fractured my grip on reality, it's still out there, still working, still spreading. The haunting hasn't ended, it's evolved. As I leave Dr. Cross's office that day, she hands me a business card for another psychiatrist. Dr. Harrison Keller, she says, he might be able to help you better than I can. I take the card, recognizing the name of my former supervisor, and smile grimly, because now I understand the pattern. The careful orchestration of encounters and referrals that have guided my journey from the morgue to this moment. And I know that whatever began with Kieran Blackthorne's impossible autopsy is far from over. If this medical horror story has kept you on edge, please subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever experienced something that challenged your understanding of reality? I'd love to hear your stories, and maybe together we can figure out what's really happening. To those of us who work with the dead, the green eyes are still watching. They're always watching, and they're looking for their next victim.